Hi folks, this is sample one of the rhetorical analysis student samples. I thought it might be useful for you to get my opinion on these things. In general, there's some very strong points to this essay. I'd say that the paragraphs are fairly focused and that the author does a pretty good job describing what the ad is and focusing on the argument tools. There are some basic challenges with this too. I think the author gets too much into evaluation and the thesis statement is difficult to see and or follow. So here's a couple of those things. Um, the author's talking about the Amazon Kindle. This material here is all of her description of the advertisement. Now, I'd say that what she needs to do here is to expand some of this material so that the reader has a better understanding. The introduction is going to grow with that development. Um, in academic essays, we're expecting the thesis statement at the end of the first paragraph. Here, there's kind of a double thesis statement here. This looks like the author's talking about pathos here, these feelings of simplicity, happiness, and freedom. Makes total sense. But then the author looks like they're doing some evaluation here. Commercial leaves the reader wanting to find those things for themselves. That's not really about rhetoric in any way. So if the thesis statement tells the reader what's going to happen, there should be feelings of simplicity, happiness, and freedom in the first body paragraph. Sure enough, we got a pretty good topic sentence here that focuses on the feelings of happiness and freedom. Great, great. That's great. Um, there's a little more description here, but let's see if I can get all this on the page. Um, here she's talking about the audience. Here she's talking some more about the audience. Here's a sort of different kind of audience. Um, you hear me say this often in your papers, folks, but this, like you lose yourself, is often very confusing for the reader. Here in this analysis, we don't want any you at all. That means you, my reader. Okay. So the author does a pretty good job staying focused. This is a pretty well-developed paragraph focusing on emotions. Here in the second paragraph in the body, we have this, which is really a description rather than a claim about using ethos, which is what's going on here. That kind of comes through here, but again, it's kind of fuzzy. I'm looking for something really, really crystal clear. This paragraph, not forecast in the thesis statement at all. Not at all. It comes as a completely new surprise to the reader, and as you can see, it's also much less developed than the previous paragraph. By the time we get to the third paragraph here, we have this logical discussion about logic and logos. Great, good topic sentence, also not in the thesis statement. So there's that kind of challenge there. And then this is obviously the shortest paragraph through the body. There's no discussion here of how the appeal is working for the particular audience. It feels like it's kind of tacked on there at the end. Um, and then what we don't have much of in the conclusion is much of a recap, kind of the main ideas. We generally want the conclusion to move from the broad to the narrow to give the reader the arguments in brief that come through the rest of the paper. And so we don't really have that. So there's some very strong points in this essay. This is my wrap up. Um, the paragraphs have got clear topic sentences. The paragraphs are pretty clearly organized around that single main idea. It's difficult to see a relation between the thesis and the rest of the body, and it's difficult often for the readers to see the relationship between all of those ideas, particularly between the arguments that are being used and the audience. So those are some ways that this essay might be improved. Hopefully some tips for you to use as you work on your own essay. I ask folks for a grade, and this is generally in the B category. Some reasonable strengths, but also some considerable weaknesses. All right, folks, thanks a lot. Hi, folks. Here we are with sample 2. As many of you mentioned on the discussion board, this is the best example we have so far. Definitely some strong points, definitely some things that could be improved. One of the things I think that jumps right out at me here is we're looking at the entire introduction, is the brevity with which this article is described, this advertisement is described. So, it's a pretty simple ad, but we can have even more here. In particular, some increased focus on who the audience is, who's going to be reading Fitness Magazine, and why does that have any relation to the pure protein bar? How does that audience shape the appeals? That's a really important thing to get in the introduction. One of the things I really like about this essay is that there's a very clear thesis statement, right? Here, we can see that we're going to have like one idea here, color appeal to emotions, layout to appeal to logic, and image to appeal to moral character. We're going to get those three basic ideas through the body of the essay in that order. It's exactly what I'm looking for. Very important piece. So here we have the author starts with description. I'm often going to advocate that you start with a claim. Instead, these three sentences are a description. But then the author sort of makes that claim to focus on the main ideas we've been talking about in class, right? One of the things this author does well is she names particular emotions that are being appealed to. And she begins to talk about how this can work with the audience. One of the things that I am going to like, you can see this paragraph is kind of short, is in this section here, she asks questions, she has exclamation point. She's assuming the reader has made the connections that she has. And that's one thing in argumentation I'm going to really discourage you from doing. I'm going to ask you to implement all of the connections that you see for the reader so they can't possibly get lost. Here, this second paragraph has a much clearer topic sentence, right? There's a reuse of language from the thesis in the topic sentence, which like locks that connection in like Legos. We have a logical connection to an emotional response here in the body. Here we've got layout to appeal to logic and emotion in the thesis statement. Okay. So that makes it really easy for the reader to come along. And we can see this paragraph is even more developed. Here she's again naming particular emotions. And she's talking about the effect on the reader. Okay, here in this sentence. Which is also done nicely, and this is a little more complex. She's talked about the relationship between logos and pathos and ethos in the body of the paragraph, or excuse me, in the ad. Again, here, she's sort of asking a question by making a statement, and what I'd say is don't ask, don't rely on the reader. Make that connection for them at all points. Here we have image again. This is less clearly focused because we get this sort of main idea in this third sentence, 3 lines down. If you look at the whole paragraph, that's a third of the way into the paragraph, right? Really want that nice and standard up front. And again, the conclusion here is a little underdeveloped. And so it's a pretty solid essay. The organization is good. The author clearly demonstrates her understanding of the concepts we've been working on. The thesis statement works well. And there's some reasonable description. The one thing this essay really needs is development, development, development. And so I'd really put this in the sort of B plus A minus range. She's done, 90% of the things right, which is where that B plus A minus comes from. Still room for improvement. If you got questions, let me know. Thanks. Hi folks, here we are with sample 3. As many of you have guessed, this is the worst of the 3 samples. And I don't include it to make fun of the original author. Of course, I've got the permission to do this. But I do it because it demonstrates something that a lot of students will do, or several things a lot of different students will do. So first, the paper is entirely too informal. There's a lot of I in this opening paragraph. And really with this paper, we're looking for a much more objective analysis, distant, separate, focusing on it rather than on I. The idea is that if I've got 3 students who are providing the same rhetorical analysis, we're going to get largely the same essay because that material doesn't change. One of the great challenges with this essay is there is no thesis statement here at the end of the first paragraph, which is something I'm really looking for. there are things like, it's very informal. So there are things like run-on sentences, or excuse me, sentence fragments. And that's fine in certain kinds of writing, not in the kind we're doing in this class. So no thesis here at the end of the first paragraph, no real topic sentence um, to focus on here at the first body paragraph. Here she's really uh, including a lot of personal response to the issue um, that really should stay out of this. Now here she's demonstrating some understanding of the concepts, pathos and ethos. Okay, that's great. But for this paper, it's going to be improved if this goes up uh, into this position where the topic sentence should be. So it sort of sets a focal point for the reader. It says, look here, we're talking about this right now. Those of you who are parents might have used this technique from time to time. Okay. Here she's again including herself. I feel this, I feel that. It's much better with this paper to talk about what they're hoping to encounter. Now she's obviously had a reaction to this Cosmo article, and it's obviously um, not her favorite thing ever. Um, but we got to keep that out. Okay, and that's often more difficult than you think. So here we are, second body paragraph. Again, no topic sentence. Again, more personal response. So really needs to, keep out of this. She's really looking to analyze the underlying issue, to analyze the stuff that's happening outside of this one particular um, magazine, advertisement, story, issue, article, whatever. Um, we'll talk about this much later, or not much later because this is a short term, but um, this is called a dropped quote, when the sentence begins with a quote and ends with a quote. It's difficult to see a connection between the author and the text, and we really want that to be crystal clear for the reader. So again, some very informal pieces here as we go through the essay. There's also a couple of, I gotta say, folks, this is not a horrible and terrible grammatical error. Minuet for a minute. This is something that, spell check won't catch. But what it does demonstrate is a general lack of attention to detail. There are other things here. You can see it on the words pointed out. Simple grammar things which really make the paper look unpolished. So if you take anything away from this, take away the idea that it's difficult to keep personal emotion out, that it's important to have structure in the paper, that it's important to maintain a formal voice through the paper, and that polish actually makes a big difference. All right, folks, thanks a lot. If you got questions, please let me know.